All right, we're going to do another episode of our Harry Potter. So I'm going to start reading here in just a second. Today is Wednesday, so tomorrow, Thursday, our packet, I'm going to send an email out. But I wanted to say first, real quick, that it's the same as it was today, pretty much. Very little changes. You're going to continue on with your assessment, and your social studies looks the same, that kind of thing. So it should be pretty simple. Again, if you have any problems with the assessment questions, give me a call, give me an email, Facebook me, whatever, and I can help you. Okay, so here we go. So they're headed to the Halloween feast. So here they go. It was decorated with hundreds and hundreds of candles. It filled pumpkins, clouds of fluttering live bats, and many flaming orange streamers, which were swimming lazily across the stormy ceiling like brilliant water snakes. The food was delicious, and even Hermione and Ron, who were full to bursting with honeydew sweets, managed second helpings of everything. Harry kept glancing at the staff table, and Professor Lupin looked cheerful, and as well as he ever did. He was talking animatedly to tiny little Professor Flitwick, the charms teacher. Harry moved his eyes along the table to the place where Snape sat. Was he imagining it, or were Snape's eyes flickering toward Lupin more often than natural? The feast finished with an entertainment provided by the Hogwarts ghost. They popped out of the walls and tables to do a bit of formation gliding. Nearly headless Nick, the Gryffindor ghost, had a great success with a reenactment of his own botched beheading. It had been such a pleasant evening that Harry's good mood couldn't even be spoiled by Malfoy, who shouted through the crowd as they all left the hall, "The Dementors send their love, Potter." Harry, Ron, and Hermione followed the rest of the Gryffindors along the usual path to Gryffindor Tower, but when they reached the corridor that ended with the portrait of the fat lady, they found it jammed with students. "Why isn't anyone going in?" said Ron curiously. Harry peered over the heads in front of him. The portrait seemed to be closed. "Let me through, please," came Percy's voice, and he came bustling importantly through the crowd. "What's the hold up here? You can't all have forgotten the password. Excuse me, I'm head boy." And then a silence fell over the crowd. From the front first, so that a chill seemed to spread down the corridor, they heard Percy say in a suddenly sharp voice, "Somebody get Professor Dumbledore, quick." People's heads turned. Those at the back were standing on tiptoe. "What's going on?" said Ginny, who had just arrived. A moment later, Professor Dumbledore was there, sweeping toward the portrait. The Gryffindors squeezed together to let him through, and Harry and Ron and Hermione moved closer to see what the trouble was. "Oh my!" Hermione grabbed Harry's arms. The fat lady had vanished from her portrait, which had been slashed so viciously that strips of canvas littered the floor. Great chunks of it had been torn away completely. Dumbledore took one quick look at the ruined painting and turned his eyes somber to see Professor McGonagall, Lupin, and Snape hurrying toward him. "We need to find her," said Dumbledore. "Professor McGonagall, please go to Mr. Filch at once and tell him to search every painting in the castle for the fat lady." "You'll be lucky," said a cackling voice. It was Peeves the poltergeist, bobbing over the crowd and looking delighted as he always did at the sight of wreckage or worry. "What do you mean, Peeves?" said Dumbledore calmly, and Peeves' grin faded a little. He didn't dare taunt Dumbledore. Instead, he opted an oily voice that was no better than his cackle. "Ashamed, your headship, sir. Doesn't want to be seen. She's a horrible mess. Saw her running through the landscape on the 4th floor, sir, dodging between the trees, crying something dreadful," he said happily. "Poor thing," he added unconvincingly. "Did she say who did it?" said Dumbledore quietly. "Oh, yes, Professor Head," said Peeves with the air of one cradling a large bombshell in his arms. "He got very angry when she wouldn't let him in, you see." Peeves flipped over and grinned at Dumbledore from between his own legs. "Nasty temper he's got, that Sirius Black." Chapter 9, The Grim Defeat. So remember, Harry thinks he keeps seeing Grims all over the place. So it says The Grim Defeat. Professor Dumbledore sent all the Gryffindors back to the Great Hall, where they were joined 10 minutes later by the students from Hufflepuff, Ravenclaw, and Slytherin, who all looked extremely confused. "The teachers and I need to conduct a thorough search of the castle," Professor Dumbledore told them as Professor McGonagall and Flitwick closed all the doors into the hall. "I'm afraid that, for your own safety, you'll have to spend the night here. I want the prefects to stand guard of the entrances to the hall, and I'm leaving the head boy and girl in charge. Any disturbance should be reported to me immediately." He added to Percy, who was looking immensely proud and important, "Send word with one of the ghosts." Professor Dumbledore paused about to leave the hall and said, "Oh yes, you'll be meeting." And one casual wave of his wand, and the long tables flew to the edges of the hall, stood themselves against the wall, and another wave, the floor was covered with hundreds of squashy purple sleeping bags. "Sleep well, said Professor Dumbledore, closing the door behind him. The hall immediately began to buzz excitedly. The Gryffindors were telling the rest of the school what had just happened. "Everyone in their sleeping bags!" shouted Percy. "Come on now! No more talking! Lights out in 10 minutes!" "Come on," Ron said to Harry and Hermione, and they seized 3 sleeping bags and dragged them into a corner. "Do you think Black's still in the castle?" Hermione whispered anxiously. "Dumbledore obviously thinks he might be," said Ron. "It's very lucky he picked tonight, you know," said Hermione. "The one night we weren't in the tower." "I reckon he's lost track of time being on the run," said Ron. "Didn't realize it was Halloween. Otherwise, he'd have come bursting in here." Hermione shuddered. All around them, people were asking one another the same question. "How did he get in?" "Maybe he knows how to apparate," said a Ravenclaw. "Just appear out of thin air, you know?" "Disguised himself properly," said a Hufflepuff 5th year. "He could have flown in," said Dean Thomas. "Honestly, am I the only person who's ever bothered to read Hogwarts a history?" said Hermione crossly to Harry and Ron. "Probably," said Ron. "Why?" "Because the castle's protected by more than walls, you know. There are all sorts of enchantments on it to stop people entering by stealth. You can't just apparate in here, and I'd like to see the disguise that could fool those Dementors. They're guarding every single entrance to the ground. They'd have seen him fly in, too, and Filch knows all the secret passages. They'll have them covered." "The lights are going out now," Percy shouted. "I want everyone in their sleeping bags. No more talking." The candles all went out at once. The only light now came from the silvery ghosts who were drifting about, talking seriously to the prefects, and the enchanted ceiling, which, like the sky outside, was scattered with stars. With that and the whispering that still filled the hall, Harry felt as though he were sleeping outdoors in a light wind. Once every hour, a teacher would appear in the hall to check that everything was quiet. Around 3 in the morning, when many students had finally fallen asleep, Professor Dumbledore came in. Harry watched him looking for Percy, who had been prowling between the sleeping bags, telling people off for talking. Percy was only a short way away from Harry and Ron and Hermione, who quickly pretended to be asleep as Dumbledore's footsteps drew nearer. "Any sign of him, Professor?" asked Percy in a whisper. "No. All well here?" "Everything under control, sir." "Good. There's no point moving them all now. I found a temporary guardian for the Gryffindor portrait hole. You'll be able to move them back in tomorrow." "And the fat lady, sir?" "Hiding in the map of Argyllshire on the 2nd floor. Apparently she refused to let Black in without the password, so he attacked. She's still very distressed, but when she's calmed down, I'll have Mr. Filch restore her." Harry heard the door of the hall creak open again and more footsteps. "Headmaster." It was Snape. Harry kept quite still, listening hard. "The whole of the 3rd floor has been searched. She's not there, and Filch has done the dungeons. Nothing there either." "What about the astronomy tower, Professor Trelawney's room, the Owlery?" "All searched." "Very well, Severus. I didn't really expect Black to linger." "Have you any theory as to how he got in, Professor?" asked Snape. Harry raised his head slightly off his arms to free his other ear. "Many, Severus. Each of them as unlikely as the next." Harry opened his eyes a fraction and squinted up to where they stood. Dumbledore's back was to him, but he could see Percy's face, rapt with attention, and Snape's profile, which looked angry. "You remember the conversation we had, Headmaster, just before the start of term?" said Snape, who was barely opening his lips as though trying to block Percy out of the conversation. "I do, Severus," said Dumbledore, and there was something like warning in his voice. "It seems almost impossible that Black could have entered the school without inside help. I did express my concerns when you appointed—" "I do not believe a single person inside this castle would have helped Black enter it," said Dumbledore, and his tone made it so clear that the subject was closed that Snape didn't reply. "I must go down to the Dementors," said Dumbledore. "I said I would inform them when our search was complete." "Didn't they want to help, sir?" said Percy. "Oh, yes," said Dumbledore coldly, "but I'm afraid no Dementor will cross the threshold of this castle while I am headmaster." Percy looked slightly abashed, and Dumbledore left the hall, walking quickly and quietly. Snape stood for a moment, watching the headmaster with an expression of deep resentment on his face. Then he, too, left. Harry glanced sideways at Ron and Hermione, and both of them had their eyes open, too, reflecting the starry ceiling. "What was that all about?" Ron mouthed. The school talked of nothing but Sirius Black for the next few days. The theories about how he had entered the castle became wilder and wilder. Hannah Abbott from Gryffindor spent much of their next herbology class telling anyone who'd listen that Black could turn into a flowering shrub. The fat lady's ripped canvas had been taken off the wall and replaced with a portrait of Sir Cadogan and his fat gray pony. Nobody was very happy about this. Sir Cadogan spent half his time challenging people to duels and the rest thinking up ridiculously complicated passwords, which he changed twice a day. "He's a complete lunatic," said Thomas Finnegan angrily to Percy. "Can't we get anyone else?" None of the other pictures wanted the job, said Percy, frightened of what happened to Fat Lady. Sir Cadogan was the only one brave enough to volunteer. Sir Cadogan, however, was the least of Harry's worries. He was now being closely watched. Teachers found excuses to walk along corridors with him, and Percy Weasley, acting, Harry suspected, on his mother's orders, was tailing him everywhere like an extremely pompous guard dog. To cap it all, Professor McGonagall summoned Harry into her office with a somber expression on her face. Harry thought someone must have died. "There's no point in hiding it from you any longer, Potter," she said in a very serious voice. "I know this will come as a shock to you, but Sirius Black—" "I know he's after me," said Harry wearily. "I heard Ron's dad telling his mom. Mr. Weasley works for the Ministry of Magic." Professor McGonagall seemed taken aback. She stared at Harry for a moment or two and said, "I see. Well, in that case, Potter, you'll understand why I don't think it's a good idea for you to be practicing Quidditch in the evenings, out on the field with only your team members. It's very exposed, Potter." "We've got our first match on Saturday," said Harry, outraged. "I've got to train, Professor." Professor McGonagall considered him intently. Harry knew she was deeply interested in the Gryffindor team prospects. It had been she, after all, who had suggested him as a seeker in the first place. He waited, holding his breath. Professor McGonagall stood up and stared out of the window. "Well, goodness knows I'd like us to win the cup this year, but all the same, Potter, I'd be happier if a teacher were present. I'll ask Madam Hooch to oversee your training sessions." The weather worsened steadily as the first Quidditch match drew nearer. Undaunted, the Gryffindor team was training harder than ever under the eye of Madam Hooch, and then, at their final training session before Saturday's match, Oliver Wood gave his team some unwelcome news. "We're not playing Slytherin," he told them, looking very angry. "Flint's just been to see me. We're playing Hufflepuff instead." "Why?" chorused the rest of the team. Flint's excuse is that their seeker's arm's still injured, but it's obviously why they're doing it. Don't want to play in this weather. Think it'll damage their chances. We're going to stop right there, find out a little bit more about what happens to Harry and Sirius Black and if they win this Quidditch match in the rain. So, again, if you have any questions, concerns, thoughts, comments, email me, text message me, Facebook message me, FaceTime me, anything. Talk to you later.